we're streaming. All right, and yeah, we're live. All right, let me go to gallery view. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Nathan Benamaz with the Hope Network, and this is the Hope for Healing Men interview series. Today, I'm with John Lee. He's an international author of over 20 books and a lifetime advocate and leader, coach, and trainer in men's personal development. Thank you for joining me, John.
Oh, you're welcome, Nathan. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's actually a funny coincidence how we met. I think I met you at the perfect time of my life. I wanted to ask you about how you got into this work and how many years you've been in this work.
Well, I guess I really would say officially, I got in this work in 1986. I wrote my first book, The Flying Boy, Healing the Wounded Man. It came out in 85. And then I opened the, what would have been the second only men's center here in Austin in 86, called the Austin Men's Center, which is still running and up. I'm no longer with it, but so that was 1986. So what is that, 30? I can't count.
It's been almost 35 years, yeah.
Long time, let's put it that. Yeah, long time. I started doing men's gatherings and men's conferences, men's workshops, men's groups in 86, and have pretty much kept doing them ever since.
Have the problems that men are dealing with changed over that almost 35 years you've been doing this, or has it evolved? And what is it men are dealing with in terms of expressing their masculinity in a mature way?
Well, you know, Nathan, I'll start with the positives, because one of the things that I have seen in 35 years is the way, especially men, interact with their children and even their spouses. That, you know, you see everything from paternity leave, which was not in existence when I started. You see fathers walking their kids up and down the park in ways that you never saw even 35 years ago. That would have been an anomaly, not the standard. And even things like in the pop culture, men are much more readily able to show emotions and to weep if they want to or need to, in ways that certainly was not done 35 years ago and back. Now, with all that said, the problems that existed 35 years ago or 350 years ago still remain, and that is the majority of men do not have access to some of the teachings, the books, the men's conferences, and that's where young men like you come into the picture to keep providing this kind of context for men. But, you know, one of the things I try to tell people like yourself and other interviewers and stuff is that we live in a very rarefied environment. For every one man who has been in therapy, let's say, or gone to a men's gathering, 500 men would not have been able to participate in that or even know that it existed. And then the other one that's still kind of the same because of that, in some ways, men are still being programmed to be shut down, to go numb, and to not experience their full capacity for an emotional life. And so, you know, it's an ever-going, ongoing job to keep providing men information and contexts and mentoring to help them with these issues.
I like that word numb you just used. I've experienced that personally. I think growing up, I was sensitive and I got bullied, and then I shut down and I was like, I can't express these sadness type of emotions. And then somewhere else in my household, I learned probably through my relationship with my mom, who was actually surprisingly more of a masculine role in parenting than my dad. I learned it wasn't okay to express anger. So I think I kind of got bottled between these two very healthy emotions, I would say.
Right.
And I think a lot of men struggle with that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, um, that was that was certainly me. I was There's been some work done by a woman named Aaron, Aron. She talks about in her books the highly sensitive person. And I was certainly in that category as a kid, but I was afraid to be sensitive or look sensitive or sound sensitive. So I cultivated a hyper masculine persona. Because again, back then, if you even read a poem out loud, you had to be gay, and so that was, I drank hard, shot pool, smoked cigarettes, anything to make me not look like the sensitive man that I was. And by the time I was 12 or 13, I was totally numb and shut down.
How much of that leads to addiction for men?
Well, again, if you're going to numb your feelings, it's helpful to have some kind of addiction in case they're about to pop out. So you drink 12 beers and now they're back down where they belong, pornography, gambling, nicotine, cocaine, work addiction. We have plenty of addictions to help keep men numbed down.
What do you think men need to break through this numbness, this apathy? Where does that change?
Well, sadly, Nathan, most men are not going to change until they're prepared to not live without something that is near and dear to them. Most men like myself, I had no interest in changing until I lost a serious love in my life. Some men, they lose a child, or they lose their job, or they lose their health. My hope and commitment to the work that I've been doing is trying to help men change without crisis. But it's usually the crisis that forces men out of their well-worn habits and patterns. But it doesn't mean it has to be. It doesn't mean it has to be.
So you're working with men as a coach and a trainer. Most of the time we change because of crisis, but you're trying to be proactive and say, hey, you don't have to wait for this terrible thing to happen.
Right.
You can change now.
Yeah, see, when I wrote my first book 36 years ago, The Flying Boy, I was very consciously, as I was writing my memoir, very consciously saying, listen, guys, read this and do not go through the pain that I'm writing about in this memoir. And, I like to think that it helped some men not have to go through the deep, deep wounding. But one of the big things is men don't have mentors anymore. And mentoring is one of the best ways for a man not have to go to the depths of pain that somebody like I had to. A mentor, a coach, a teacher is meant to cut that pain at least by half. But the sad thing is most men don't readily pursue mentors, and most men who are capable of being mentors don't readily pursue mentorees.
Wow. So I'm actually hearing, and I'm connecting a dot here on the lack of mentorship for men. I think part of this is linked to the breakdown in families. Like the first mentor you have and role model is a father and a mother. And then there's also a breakdown in communities as people are engaging in this new digital world. Communities don't have the same strength that they once had. So I think generally speaking, there's been a major shift in terms of the support structure for people, and in particular for this conversation, men.
Right. Yeah. See, your dad is supposed to be your primary model for masculinity, but he's not supposed to be your mentor.
Mm.
There's too much tension and conflict in the father-son relationship generally for him to be a superb mentor. So traditionally in indigenous cultures and even in our own Western European society 100 years ago, we were living with uncles and grandfathers and much tighter community of men. And those were the men who were supposed to take us aside and tell us the secrets of masculinity, give us the rituals of masculinity, and that's been all but abolished now. So a lot of men have anger at their fathers for not being their mentors. And that's one thing that I've written about is that yes, you have every right to be angry at your father for whatever was or was not happening, but not him not being a mentor somewhere else. You know, like my uncles were just as dysfunctional as my father. So, but I had one grandfather who really took me under his wing in a lot of ways, and sort of without him being able to identify his behavior as mentoring, he did provide some of that. But generally, like you said, now we're so disconnected. It's really hard to get that.
Well, that's the premise of the men's work, which before you were saying for every man who has access to it, maybe there's 500 that don't. But the premise of what we're starting to see, which you actually laid the foundation for, I would assert that the work you started 35 some years ago has now culminated into little pockets and brush fires of men all over the world starting to have these conversations because someone took the initiative to actually start it.
Right. And that's the good news again. See, you know, when Robert Bly, who is really the father of the early men's movement, men's work, you know, would congregate 1,000, 2,000 men. Well, there's no such congregations much happening now. But like you just said, there's men's groups and men's weekends of 10 or 12. Like late in November, I'm doing an online men's gathering in Australia. There'll be, 15, 20 guys in the room. That's happening all over the world, Germany, France, Italy, Latin cultures. And again, some of the behaviors that men are displaying now don't even know that they have that relationship to, say, the Robert Blys of the world from 36 to 40 years ago, but they're benefiting from it.
And that's also important to say that even though we might not see the fruit of what we're investing today in something, we don't know the difference 1, 2, or 3 decades down the road, that the momentum of what we're putting in right now could be something significant. And in this case of what we're talking about, it certainly has made a big difference.
Yeah, see, when we were doing the big men's gatherings, one of the phrases that both Robert and I agreed on, one of us would say at the conferences is, listen, you guys that are here 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, what we're teaching and talking about is not really going to help your life so much, but it's going to help your sons and daughters' lives. And it's going to help your grandsons and granddaughters' lives. And yes, yours will improve some, but we began the men's work with this idea that what we want to impact and affect is generations to come. And that's why now I can see a man walking down my street with a I don't know what you call it anymore, but a papoose kind of thing or whatever it is with a baby inside. You didn't see that 35 years ago. You certainly didn't see it in my father's generation. You know, I was certainly not raised to carry a baby on my chest. Now, by the time I hit my 30s or 40s, I became that guy. But my upbringing prepared me only to go to work, go to war, make money, put a roof over somebody's head, clothes on somebody's back, and food on somebody's table. And the whole emotional area of life was supposed to be relegated to the mother. And that's what's happened of my generation is somewhat. Most of the men, the fathers, were gone to war or to work. And so predominantly people my generation was primarily raised by their mothers.
How, what you're talking about with developing a man in his emotional sense, how much of the expectation that a man needs to be a provider is developing men more in the intellectual capacities, but less in the emotional? This is an unconscious expectation that's being put on men, and it's forcing men to feel like they have to perform. And then if they don't perform, they end up depressed, lonely, isolated. I mean, how much of these expectations is causing, and we didn't talk about, but in the video I sent you, I talk about the suicide rate amongst men. I mean, how much of this is contributing to mental health issues and depression?
Right. Well, see, men have always been seen as success objects. We used to talk in the old days about women being sex objects, but men have always been success objects. And we built our self-esteem and self-worth and our own sense of masculinity in direct proportion to how.
John, I lost you. Do you hear me?
Did become successful, but we did not become somebody that could turn inward and feel like we were succeeding on this emotional and spiritual level. So at the beginning of the men's movement, there was some criticism launched that we weren't politically active enough. And one of the things we said is that the men's movement that I and Robert Bly and others participated in was an internal movement, that we needed to turn inward to see what was going on instead of more political power or material success. And now, men are under so much pressure that suicide is a big thing. Your generation is really the first generation who's not going to be able to do better than their parents. And that's a lot of pressure right there.
Wow. I never quite heard it like that. Yeah. And I think that's what we're dealing with. And not to make it political, but I think that's part of the political differences that are happening between baby boomers and millennials, is that failed transference of forward momentum. We're actually, and at least in the financial sense, we're not succeeding as much. But there is another component. You're talking about the spiritual and internal, and we're trying to figure out how to be better people. So if we can make the world better for the next generation.
But again, I just keep reiterating this, that where all of this has been skewed a little bit is not taking into account the rarefied environment in which you and I, and most of the people who are going to watch this, participate in. That you go down to Birmingham, Alabama, and most of the guys are going to be living essentially like they did 50 years ago. Now you go to San Francisco or Seattle or here in Austin, Texas, you'll see a different kind of man. But again, you go to some of these underdeveloped countries where they're still living like they did 1,000 years ago in some ways. See, we got to always keep remembering that we got to do more than preach to the choir. And that's what our men's movement really was about to a large degree. Most of the men who came to mine in Robert Bly's and Mankind Project, they were already sort of members of the choir. And we were just, reiterating some of what they already knew. It's people like what you're trying to do and others to extend this out to people who don't live in this rarefied environment.
Not to make it like religious, but that's kind of what Jesus did, right? He didn't hang around with the Pharisees. He went out to the broken people, and he made his work about that. And
of course, he got killed for it. But so far, nobody has accused me of being anything like Jesus, nor has anybody shot me yet. But yeah, no, and that's the way it goes. And that's why I wrote my books, Nathan, the way I did. I consciously wrote my books so that the guy in Birmingham, Alabama would relate, hopefully, and the therapist in Chicago would relate to it. But, I'm a blue collar. I was born into upper low, if that's a category. My father was a machinist. I was the first one on both sides of my family to go to college. So the people that I try to connect with has always been mostly those people, but also I wanted to invite the academics and the intellectuals in. But that was where Robert Bly, that was his forte, really. Was to speak to the academic and the intellectual, because he was smart.
I hear that, and that's one thing that impressed me when I met you the first time, is how relatable you are. And even reading your books, I got present to, like, it was your personal story. You weren't telling me what to do. You were sharing your own experience. And inside of that, I got present to that you had gained wisdom, like you said before, through crisis, and you wanted to impart that wisdom upon the next generation.
Well, thank you for saying that. All my books, all of them, I've written 25, all of them emanate out of my old failures. It's like my dad said one time, he said, so people buy your books and they come hear your talks. I go, yeah. And he said, well, explain that to me, because I've read some of your books, and in all your books, you're talking about how badly you failed. He said, why would people come pay you? And I said, got me, Dad. But it was kind of funny. It's like he just couldn't make the connection. I read a couple of your books, John, and they're about your failed relationship. And I said, yeah, I'm glad it's America, because if I was in Russia, they'd have probably just taken me out and shot me. So.
That's funny. And I think that speaks to the big difference in masculinity of where we're coming from and where we're heading is how we define success. And I think we're redefining success. And it sounds like something about a purposeful life. I mean, how would you say men find purpose and meaning in life?
Well, I'm going to tell you the sad thing is most men don't. And that's why suicide rates and addiction is so high. Most men, to quote Thoreau, live lives of quiet desperation. They go to work, they go have a beer, they come home, they play with their kids or watch television, go to bed, and do it all over again. And so, one of my commitments in my teaching work was try to provide, like the book that came out a few years ago called The Half-Lived Life, is to make sure that you're following your passions and your dreams, because if you are, then that's what's going to give you purpose and meaning. But if you're just working at a job that you do not want to be at, you can do therapy 2 times a week, and that's not going to offset your despair at not being able to follow those dreams or follow that, as Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. And so one of the things I wanted to do was make sure, seeing my dad and my uncles live lives of quiet desperation. And I won't say there hasn't been desperation in my life, but I wanted to make sure that I did follow my dreams and my passion because I wanted meaning. I remember one time me and my dad had a conversation. I was teaching at the University of Alabama after I got my master's. And he asked me, he said, "So how much do you make teaching college?" And I said, "Well, not very much." Now, this was in 1976, we'll say, 77. And he said, "So how much?" And I said, "I make about 22,000 a year." And he said, "Well, John, you could come to work for me at the plant, and with overtime, you could make 35, 36,000 a year." And I said, "But Dad, I would hate every day of my life. And teaching college, I love what I do every day of my life." And he said, "Where did you ever get the idea that you were supposed to love what you do?" And I said, "I got it from you." He said, "You couldn't have got it from me. I hated every goddamn day I went to work." And I said, "That's right. I got it from you." No passion, no purpose, no bliss. And as I've aged, I feel a great deal of sadness for him and the man I was supposed to be, which would say, "Oh, yeah, I'll take that 36,000 at the plant. I'll work there till retirement, and then I'll move to Florida and I'll die."
Wow.
There's a poem I want to recite by the German poet Rilke that expresses this idea even more profoundly and deeply. It's a very short poem. He says, "Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors and keeps on walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And his children say blessings on him as if he were dead, while other men stay inside with the dishes and the glasses, and they force their children to go far out into the world to find that church which he forgot."
Wow.
See?
So that's going out. So that actually happened to you. You saw your dad locked in a prison of his own making, and you did not want that for yourself. And so you decided to pursue uh, a
Stand
life
up
of
during
meaning.
supper, walk outdoors, and keep on walking because of something, a church, a calling, a passion. And then when your children see your father do that, they know that they too are capable of standing up during supper and walking outdoors, while other men stay inside with the dishes and the glasses. See, and every time I'd read that poem or hear that poem, I would think of my dad's little whiskey glasses. That's what he inhabited.
Hmm.
And even though I became an alcoholic, I still went out and to seek that church. A lot of men seek that spiritual church, that emotional church in alcohol. It has been said by many more people than I, is scratch an alcoholic and you find a mystic. You know, that the alcoholic is somebody who doesn't know about this inner life or where to go to have it enhanced or trained. So you scratch an alcoholic and you find somebody who has got all this desire for deeper, but doesn't know how to get it. So keep drinking.
And that's where the mentorship comes in.
Right.
I want to ask you about the difference between boys and men, because there's some strong character contrasts, and we're not really transitioning boys to men, and we're staying boys longer in life. And some would say some men are even dying boys later in life. What would you say the distinction, and how do we transition between the
Well,
two?
you know, again, not to be too political, but just think about the name that these people call themselves, Proud Boys. They didn't even think to call themselves proud men. They're still boys. And we have a lot of boy culture now. Robert Bly wrote a book back in, I'm going to say, maybe 98 or 99 called The Sibling Society. And in that book, what he says is that there's no grown-ups at the helm, that there's just fellow boys running the world. And I agree with that. And then I wrote a book called Growing Yourself Back Up, which was an attempt to say, listen, you know, like the flying boy, we're boys in men's bodies and men's clothes, but we're still thinking like in terms of the environment, say, we still think like boys, where we don't have to prepare for 7 generations. We'll just grab all the marbles we can and to hell with future generations. And that's an immaturity that the planet cannot sustain.
Wow. So the maturity of a man is someone who can take care of the people around him and also have enough foresight to take care of future generations.
That's right. That's right. You know, the old Native American thing of, you know, Western European man thinks about the generation they're in, and they would plan for 7 generations out. And we don't. You know, we're an adolescent culture, and there's no greater adolescent at the helm than Donald Trump. He's a big boy, and I just alienated some of your listeners, but on the aftermath of the election, you know, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, doesn't matter. What you're seeing is boyish behavior.
I'm actually really pleased with the results of the election, because one of my problems was I didn't see people being responsible on both sides. I mean, I saw this definitely coming out of Donald Trump, and I'm not giving Nancy Pelosi and the left a pass because I saw them playing the same game. So the way I saw it was like, great, we split the election. I mean, to me, I feel that what's missing in the world is responsibility, and it's the same thing that happens in the conflicts around the world, whether it's Israelis and Palestinians, whether it's the divisions between African Americans and white people. It's just no one wants to be responsible for their turf. It's all about what the other side did that justifies our own irresponsibility. So
Well, that's true.
I'm
If
most
I had my choice, I wouldn't have voted for either one of them.
oh, definitely not.
But I got to tell you the distinction. Again, whether you're Democrat or Republican, if you look at the way Obama carried himself in the world, you saw an adult. You look at the Trump making fun of the mentally disturbed, all the stuff that was said. He talked like a big boy, about people and things. So one of the things that the men's work must continue to do is to help us grow up, help us mature, and then help us pass that maturity on through the generations. See, like if you have kids, which may or may not be part of your plan, you're going to raise a different kind of son than the father who raised you or the father who raised me. How's that for a good place to stop?
That's great. Well, I got that we're building on each successive generation, and I'm thankful for the work you've done and for the work my dad did. I know he obviously gave me a better life than his father gave him, and I guess if we constantly live in that vein of giving just a little bit better to each generation, we're contributing the best.
It may not happen on material levels, but on spiritual, emotional intelligence levels, Now, I want to always, whenever I give a talk or an interview about men's stuff, I want to bring up the name, which I hope will never be forgotten, but many men have never heard. And that is the poet and storyteller, Robert Bly. Had it not been for Robert Bly, you and I would not be speaking. That's how important he was to this burgeoning men's movement work, that he was so adept and so charismatic, so articulate, so emotionally in touch, that he impacted lives who will never have heard his name. And while I admit I've worked my ass off, I hope I've done a pretty good job, I have to always tell people, if it wasn't for his work, you and I wouldn't be talking. You might be talking to somebody else, but it wouldn't be me. Okay?
That's great. Well, we'll put some links below so people can check out Robert Bly's work as well as your work, John. And
yeah, if you'll put a link to my website, stuff like that, I'd appreciate it. And then once you're up and running, if you'll let us know, then we'll make a link on my website to the video that you're putting together.
Perfect. Thanks so much, John. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate everything you've been through.
Well, thank you, bud. It's my pleasure. Keep doing the good work, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Looking forward to it. Take care, John.
Bye-bye.